I never expected enlightenment to feel like a quiet fracture inside my mind. Not the violent shattering I always imagined, more like the gentle, devastating sound of a thread snapping after years of strain. It happened late at night, when the apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant, repetitive tapping of Victor typing in the living room. He claimed he was working on a pitch, though I had long stopped asking for details. Every conversation with him had become a negotiation of tone, of timing, of how much of myself I was allowed to show without provoking one of his weary sighs. I was sitting on the edge of the bed with a philosophy text open on my lap, a book he once mockingly called Mental Gymnastics. Maybe that was what pushed me to finish it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I was still capable of thinking clearly, even if my life didn't reflect it. The page I was reading was titled Self-Deception and the Architecture of Compromise. A dense, academic title, yet the words beneath it pierced me with unsettling precision. It said that humans often stay in situations not because they are meaningful, but because they are familiar. Because starting over feels like admitting failure. Because comfort is easier than truth. Because the emotional cost of leaving feels higher than the cost of staying, even when staying hollows us out. I stared at the paragraphs, and the air in my lungs turned heavy. Suddenly, years of small compromises rushed back at me with brutal clarity. The dinners I ate alone because he was busy. The conversations cut short because he found my concerns dramatic. The way he praised himself for putting up with me when I was overwhelmed with work or family issues. The tiny comments, disguised as jokes, that chipped away at my confidence. I realized I had not been in love. I had been invested. I had poured time, effort, apologies, excuses, and entire pieces of myself into something that only stood upright because I held it together. The sunk cost fallacy in human form. That realization didn't hurt the way heartbreak should. It simply felt clean, as if a fog lifted and revealed that the landscape beneath it had always been barren. I closed the book gently and placed it beside me. The apartment looked the same soft lamplight, the same framed prints Victor chose because they looked neutral, the same carefully controlled environment he preferred. Yet everything felt fundamentally different. I could finally see the truth. I had been sleepwalking through my own life. I stood up slowly, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain, and walked toward the living room doorway. From where I stood, I could see Victor hunched over his laptop, headphones on, his fingers dancing quickly across the keys. Focused. Intent. Detached. He didn't notice me watching him, not that he would have cared. But instead of sadness, I felt something unexpected. Distance. A calm, analytical distance, as if I were observing a stranger whose choices were no longer tied to my fate. I returned to the bedroom and began organizing his gym bag for the next morning, a routine I did out of habit rather than affection. That's when I saw it. His keychain, a small metal atom symbol we once bought at a science museum, had something new attached to it. A second key. Tiny. Silver. Familiar in shape but not to anything we owned. I picked it up gently, noticing the thin wire securing it to the keyring. A makeshift attachment, sloppy and rushed. Very unlike Victor, who obsessed over appearances. A cold instinct settled into my stomach. I remembered, suddenly and vividly, that he had mentioned helping his childhood friend, Sophia, find a temporary place to stay. He had been vague about the details, too vague. He brushed the subject away each time afterward. I felt the subtle click of intuition, sharp and undeniable. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And for once, I wasn't blinded by excuses or fear of confrontation. The intellectual rebirth I experienced didn't just give clarity. It gave me courage, quiet, razor-edged courage. I placed the key back carefully, my heartbeat steady, not frantic. My hands didn't shake. My vision didn't blur. I was fully awake. And whatever truth that key belonged to, I was ready to see it. The next morning, I woke with an eerie sense of calm. Not peace, just clarity, like the first seconds after emerging from a long dive, when oxygen finally rushes back into your lungs. The world looked sharper. My thoughts were crisp and sorted, as if someone had quietly reorganized my mind while I slept. Victor was already gone, which was his usual habit. He preferred slipping out early without fuss, without conversation, without the messy reality of two people sharing a life. In that silence, I felt no ache, no loneliness, only the faint echo of all the mornings I hadn't questioned. The book was still on my nightstand. The key was still on his keychain. That was all I needed to remember. The shift wasn't a dream. I made myself coffee, strong, unsweetened, grounding, and sat at the kitchen counter, staring at the faint condensation on the window. My eyes kept drifting to the memory of that second key, that thin wire looped through the metal atom symbol. The key didn't belong to our life. It belonged to someone else's. And now that I was no longer lying to myself, I could feel the truth vibrating beneath the surface, subtle but relentless. By midday, I had formed a plan. Not emotional, not dramatic, just orderly, like a sequence of hypotheses I intended to test. The intellectual clarity I gained the night before hadn't faded. It had settled deeper, becoming a kind of anchor I had never possessed before. I waited until Victor texted, going to the gym after work, home late, eat without me. A familiar pattern, a convenient excuse. Instead of anger, I felt a quiet affirmation. Every lie was now just a breadcrumb leading me where I needed to go. Before leaving the apartment, I opened the small drawer where we kept spare devices. Victor believed in tech rotation, which really meant he constantly upgraded his phones, tablets, headsets, leaving behind a trail of functional, half-used electronics. I pulled out an old laptop of mine, one I hadn't touched in almost a year. It still had stickers from my university days, crooked geometric shapes, and a faded one that read "Think outside the narrative." I had forgotten how much those words meant to me once. I wiped the dust off the screen, powered it on, and waited. It felt symbolic somehow, reclaiming something I abandoned for convenience, the same way I had abandoned pieces of myself. Once it loaded, I searched for public property records, not because I expected an instant revelation, but because my mind was now tuned for detection. The key was too small for an apartment door, too plain for a fancy hotel, too clean to be for something old. Storage units. Industrial. Uniform. Rented in quiet corners of nearby towns. I found a directory and scanned the lock types. Some matched, some didn't. One, however, caught my eye, a self-storage facility 2 towns over that used miniature silver keys with a ridged head. The same shape I remembered from Victor's keychain. My pulse didn't spike. My breath didn't stutter. The certainty settled into me like a quiet truth. I drove there in the late afternoon, the winter light pale and soft across the highway. The entire drive felt strangely detached, as if I were observing myself from the outside, a woman following a thread that had already been tied long before she noticed. When I reached the facility, I parked far from the cameras, acting on intuition more than fear. The place was almost empty, a wide grid of metal doors and cracked asphalt. The cold wind carried a faint metallic smell as I walked between the rows. I scanned the numbers. 114, 115, 116, then 117. It was identical to the others, yet I felt its significance before I even touched the handle. I reached out slowly, half expecting resistance, half expecting the universe to intervene and stop me. But the door didn't need a key to check if it was occupied. I lifted the latch. It moved. Unlocked. The door slid upward with a low groan, revealing a dim interior that made my breath halt for just a moment. Not storage boxes. Not sports equipment. Not anything that could be explained away. Instead, a full set of expensive furniture arranged neatly, as if waiting for someone to return any minute. A wardrobe filled with clothes, labeled and sorted. A vanity with perfume bottles. A half-open planner on a desk, filled with lists written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Sophia's handwriting. I recognized it from the brief notes she once left on Victor's fridge when she visited. I walked inside slowly, the air cold and still. There, on the open page of the planner, written in looping ink, Our anniversary, 4 p.m. dinner. Future house hunt, finalized by next month. My fingers hovered just above the page, not touching, not shaking. The truth wasn't sharp. It wasn't painful. It was simply undeniable. I didn't leave in a rush. I didn't cry. I stood there, absorbing the full landscape of my old illusions collapsing in silence. When I finally stepped out and closed the door behind me, I felt it again, that same inner shift from the night before. This wasn't heartbreak. It was awakening. And now that I was awake, I would not go back to sleep. The drive back was quiet. Not externally. Cars roared past on the highway. Radios played from open windows. Someone honked impatiently 2 lanes over. But internally, I was in a stillness so absolute it felt like stepping into a sealed room. It wasn't shock. It wasn't numbness. It was recognition. Every page of that planner was a mirror, held up without mercy. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the late afternoon had shifted into the soft blue of early evening. Streetlights flickered on one by one, like the world was preparing itself for the reveal waiting inside me. I parked, sat for a moment, and pressed my palms flat against the steering wheel. They had a life, a home, a calendar, a future, and I had routines, compromises, a slowly draining reservoir of self-deception that I mistook for devotion. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. The cold air stung my cheeks, bringing a strange sense of satisfaction. Sensation meant I was alive, aware, awake in a way I hadn't been for 2 years. Upstairs, the apartment looked exactly as I left it, tidy, functional, the kind of place that could belong to anyone. That realization struck deeper than anything I had found in the storage unit. The place reflected neutrality, not partnership. There was nothing uniquely mine here. Nothing shared. Just a functional backdrop for a relationship I had been desperately trying to animate. I placed my keys on the table and stood there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was accusatory. I walked toward the bedroom, feeling the weight of everything I had overlooked. The subtle changes in Victor's schedule. The sudden increase in gym nights. The weekends he insisted on visiting his parents alone. The new shirt he said he bought on sale, the one Sophia once complimented online in a post he thought I hadn't seen. I opened my bedside drawer and pulled out the philosophy book, the one responsible for that moment of awakening. The passage that had cracked open something inside me now echoed like a prophecy fulfilled. Most lives are not built on truth, but on the stories we are too afraid to stop telling ourselves. I closed the book gently. I wasn't afraid anymore. Somewhere in that clarity, my mind drifted back to Elias. Not in a longing way, not yet, not anything resembling a romantic spark, but as the one person who had always seen Victor without illusions. The one person who valued honesty the way some people value oxygen. I remembered the way he looked at me during Victor's sister's divorce, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if he could already sense the cracks in the foundation of my relationship. Back then, I thought he was simply protective of his family. Now I wondered if he had understood things about Victor long before I did. I sat at the edge of the bed and took a breath, letting the air settle deep in my lungs. The next step had to be deliberate. No confrontation. No emotional explosion. Those would only give Victor ways to redirect, deny, distort. I wanted truth, not performance. So I reached for my phone and typed a message I never imagined sending. I need to speak to you. It's important. I didn't have to specify who I meant. Elias would know. I placed the phone beside me and stared at the ceiling. The apartment felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because I had. This wasn't my home anymore. It was evidence, a setting, a collection of props in a story that had already ended. The phone buzzed. I picked it up slowly. Elias, where are you? Are you safe? It was such a simple question, but something in me tightened. Safe. For the first time, I realized the answer needed to be more than reflexive politeness. I typed, yes. I found something. I need your insight. Seconds later, tell me when and where. Direct. Grounded. uncomplicated. Qualities I hadn't realized I had been starving for. I hesitated before typing back, not out of fear, but because this moment felt like a hinge, the quiet shift between the life I had endured and the life I was about to choose. Tomorrow. The cafe near the library. 5 p.m. His reply came almost instantly. I'll be there. I put the phone down and exhaled slowly, feeling something subtle uncoil inside me. It wasn't hope. It wasn't relief. It was alignment, the sensation of finally stepping in sync with my own mind. The night stretched ahead, calm and sharp. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for Victor to come home. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't rehearsing excuses or smoothing over invisible fractures. I was simply living inside the truth. And with that truth, one thing became certain. The story I had been telling myself for 2 years had ended in chapter 2. Everything beyond this point would be written differently, by me, for me. The afternoon sun slanted through my apartment window, casting angular beams across the stacks of papers I had pulled from Victor's shared storage unit. Each sheet felt heavier than the last, not just with the weight of numbers and contracts, but with the unmistakable evidence of duplicity. I had thought I understood compromise, or at least convinced myself that comfort could substitute for clarity. But as I traced the entries detailing joint purchases for a space that was never meant for me, clarity cut sharper than I had expected. Elias had arrived earlier, his presence quietly commanding in the corner of my study. He carried no judgment on his face, just a professional calm that somehow made the chaos of my discovery easier to bear. I had explained the key, the unit, the planner with its carefully penciled anniversaries and house hunts, and he had listened. Now, as I leafed through financial statements and receipts, his gaze followed me, attentive without intruding. There was a subtle warmth in the way he lingered near the edge of my desk, as if he wanted to offer support but understood the boundary between help and interference. I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear or anger, though there was plenty of both, but with this strange flutter of recognition. Elias was someone who valued precision as much as I did, someone whose mind could navigate through deceit and obfuscation with ease. There was a symmetry in our approach, calm, analytical, relentless. I realized that for the first time in weeks, I was not alone in untangling the threads of betrayal. Not that I needed someone to save me. This was mine to face, but the quiet acknowledgement of shared intellect was comforting, almost intoxicating. "What do you make of this?" I asked, pointing to an entry in a ledger that outlined a series of expenses labeled vaguely, as if to disguise them. My voice was steady, but my hand shook slightly as I touched the paper. Elias leaned over, his shoulder brushing mine. It was accidental, I told myself, but I felt a brief, electric thrill at the contact. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing as he scanned the line of numbers. "It's a classic misdirection," he said quietly. "He's built an entire narrative to cover personal indulgences under professional guise. It's meticulous, but sloppy in the assumption that no one would cross-check." I nodded, mentally cataloging his observations. Every detail, he pointed out, fit like puzzle pieces I had been struggling to align. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. And yet, there was an odd dissonance. The professional calm in his voice carried a subtle undercurrent of something more, care, maybe even admiration. I caught myself wondering if he noticed how I hesitated before flipping the next page, how I lingered too long over entries that were mine to expose. "I think," I said carefully, "this is enough to start the formal reporting process. If we document each expense, each hidden transaction, and cross-reference it with city property records, we can make an airtight case." My eyes met his briefly, and I detected a flash of acknowledgement, of silent approval. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it sent a warmth curling up my spine that had nothing to do with the sun slanting through the window. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood behind me, hands folded lightly over his own, and watched as I organized the documents. There was a presence in the room that felt protective, patient, and, dare I admit it, slightly magnetic. I could feel his confidence brush against my own insecurities, steadying me without words, as though simply by being near, he made the impossible seem manageable. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible sigh. For weeks, I had carried the burden of this betrayal alone. Now, I felt the weight lessen, not just from the knowledge that Elias would help guide the process, but from the unspoken understanding between us that this was a partnership forged in both intellect and instinct. A subtle heat pooled in my chest as I met his gaze again, catching the hint of a smile that didn't belong to the battlefield of legalities and paperwork, but to the quiet, unspoken recognition of kindred minds. We didn't speak of it. We didn't need to. And yet, in that brief, charged silence, I realized that this was the first time since discovering the truth about Victor that I felt not only capable, but alive. Alive, and startlingly aware that trust could exist outside betrayal, and that perhaps, in this rare alignment of intellect and respect, there could be something more. The city lights glimmered through my apartment window as the evening deepened, and I sat hunched over the collection of papers that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. Each invoice, each receipt, each coded note in Victor's hidden records confirmed the extent of the duplicity I had stumbled into. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, legal, and meticulously orchestrated. Every fiber of my being, sharpened by the rebirth I had experienced, screamed that I couldn't afford to falter. Not now, not ever. Elias moved around the room with quiet purpose, carrying a laptop under one arm and a stack of reference binders in the other. He placed them neatly on the coffee table, never disturbing the documents I had been methodically sorting. The combination of his calm efficiency and the warmth of his presence was grounding, like a stabilizing force in a storm that had been raging for far too long. I noticed, almost reluctantly, that his eyes kept flicking toward me, not in a way that was intrusive, but in that silent way of someone who understood the gravity of the situation and my need to feel in control. "Anya," he said softly, kneeling to plug in the laptop, "if we cross-reference these ledgers with the city's property and tax records, we can map out the entire network of concealed assets. Every payment that Victor and Sophia made on that apartment, every gift, every unreported expense, there's a pattern here." His fingers moved deftly over the keyboard, pulling up databases and legal filings, his movements fluid and assured. Watching him, I felt a surge of something I hadn't expected, admiration mixed with a subtle flutter of attraction. It wasn't purely professional anymore. There was a shared intensity, a silent acknowledgement of the stakes, and a growing sense of intimacy that was impossible to ignore. I leaned over the edge of the table, brushing against his arm as I reached for a set of receipts. The contact was brief, accidental, and yet it sent a ripple through me. Elias noticed. His head turned, and for a moment our eyes met. There was a flicker in his gaze, a look that was equal parts concern, appreciation, and something I didn't have a name for yet. I quickly returned to my work, pretending that my heartbeat wasn't a little louder than it should have been. The night deepened, but the work didn't stop. We traced transactions through multiple accounts, flagged every irregularity, and created a visual map of Victor and Sophia's hidden finances. It was painstaking, methodical work, the kind that required absolute focus. But I could feel Elias' presence beside me like a quiet shield, giving me the courage to face the enormity of the betrayal. In moments of brief respite, we shared subtle glances, an almost imperceptible touch of fingers on papers, a brief brushing of shoulders, that made the tension between us feel electric yet restrained. At one point, I paused, staring at a particularly damning entry in the ledger. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the clarity and the raw, invigorating energy of being fully awake to the truth. Elias noticed, and without words, he reached out, placing his hand lightly over mine. The gesture was simple, professional, and utterly intimate all at once. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized I had been craving a steady, reliable partner. Not someone to fix me, but someone whose strength complemented mine, someone whose intellect matched mine, and whose loyalty was unwavering. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low, steady, and grounding. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to acknowledge the possibility of more than professional trust. There was something in his eyes that invited me in, a subtle, careful warmth that didn't rush or pressure, but simply offered presence and solidarity. "I'm more than okay," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I'm ready." And in that readiness, in the midst of the stacks of evidence and the late-night glow of my apartment, I felt a connection to Elias that went beyond strategy and intellect. It was a quiet, simmering spark that promised partnership, loyalty, and maybe, just maybe, something more. As the night stretched on, we continued to sift through the hidden truths of Victor's life. But now, every discovery, every confirmed deception, every triumph in piecing together the puzzle was shared. And in that sharing, I realized that the rebirth I had experienced wasn't just about exposing betrayal. It was about finding the person who could stand beside me through it all. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of hope, trust, and a delicate, undeniable attraction growing in tandem with our mission. The city was quiet outside, but inside, the apartment buzzed with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. Each document we uncovered, each ledger entry we traced, was another piece of the mosaic that revealed Victor's duplicity. Elias hovered near the laptop, fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to cross-check the latest batch of transactions. His presence was steady, reassuring, yet somehow thrilling, like walking a tightrope with someone whose balance perfectly matched your own. I leaned over the table again, tracing a series of transfers from Victor's company account to a small offshore account in Sophia's name. The sums were significant, the timing deliberate, and every detail screamed premeditation. "These aren't random," I murmured, feeling my pulse quicken. "He's building something, and it's all hidden from me." Elias didn't say anything immediately. He simply reached over, tapping a few keys to overlay the bank records with property ownership files. The screen filled with a web of connections, apartment leases, furniture purchases, luxury gifts, and payments, all converging in a way that made Victor's secret life undeniable. I felt the weight of betrayal settle in my chest, sharp but clarifying, like sunlight-piercing fog. We worked side by side in silence for long stretches, only breaking to exchange a glance or a subtle nod. Each time our hands brushed on papers on the keyboard, my chest tightened with a delicious mixture of awareness and restraint. There was something electric in the way Elias didn't overstep, how his focus never faltered, yet he remained aware of the tiny intimacies, the sparks that danced between us. I paused, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and found him watching me with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "You're relentless," he said, voice low, almost teasing. "I like that." My lips twitched into a small, surprised smile. I hadn't expected flirtation in the middle of this investigation, yet the warmth in his eyes was undeniable. It was as though he could see both the fury and the brilliance coiled inside me, and he admired both equally. "Only when it matters," I replied, letting my tone slide into playful defiance. Our banter was brief, almost imperceptible, yet the tension hummed between us like a live wire. I felt the familiar fire of attraction I'd buried under shock and strategy since discovering Victor's duplicity. Elias's gaze didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened, a silent acknowledgement of what was growing between us. Returning to the spreadsheets, we uncovered more anomalies, fake invoices, duplicate payments, falsified receipts. I felt a surge of satisfaction, not at the deception itself, but at the clarity we were creating from chaos. With Elias beside me, I realized the rebirth wasn't just about exposing Victor. It was about reclaiming my own power, my intellect, and my right to demand truth and loyalty. And perhaps, I admitted to myself quietly, it was also about discovering someone who could match that intensity, someone I could trust without question. Hours passed unnoticed. The city darkened, and the glow of the laptop illuminated our determined faces. Elias leaned back slightly, stretching, and our hands brushed again, this time intentionally, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the contact linger, feeling the subtle heat of it travel up my arm. His fingers flexed lightly, and our eyes met. For a heartbeat, The world shrank to the two of us, caught in this intimate, unspoken connection amidst chaos. "You know," he said, voice softer now, "we make a good team." There was an edge to his tone, a flirtatious undercurrent that made my pulse race. "Better than Victor ever gave you credit for having." I swallowed, feeling a mix of relief, desire, and cautious hope. "We do," I admitted, allowing a flicker of warmth into my voice. "I couldn't have done this alone." He leaned a little closer, close enough that I could feel his breath brush my ear as he muttered, almost conspiratorially, "And yet, I have a feeling we're just getting started." My stomach flipped. I realized in that moment that this partnership was no longer purely professional. It was personal, electric, and deeply compelling. The night stretched on, but for the first time since the betrayal, I felt both danger and safety coexisting. Danger from the truths we were uncovering, safety in the presence of someone who saw me fully, respected me, and, yes, wanted me. Elias glanced at me, a faint, teasing smirk tugging at his lips, and I felt the boldness return. Tomorrow, we would strike at Victor's secrets. Tonight, we allowed ourselves this unspoken acknowledgement. Two allies, a shared purpose, and a spark neither of us could ignore. Morning light filtered through the blinds, painting the apartment in muted stripes. I was already awake, moving methodically, reviewing notes and preparing the evidence we would use today. Elias was still sleeping, the soft rise and fall of his chest a rare, grounding presence that made the chaos of yesterday feel tangible. I watched him for a moment, aware of the subtle tension that lingered between us, an electric thread woven through our professional alliance, and now something undeniably personal. We had a plan. Victor's layers of deception were intricate, but with the documentation we'd compiled, the leverage was ours. I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't known in months. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about reclaiming control over my life, my choices, and my future. Elias stirred and I smiled, a small, conspiratorial grin. "Ready?" I asked. He nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in response, a quiet acknowledgement of both the strategy and the unspoken connection between us. Our first move was subtle but effective. I sent carefully worded inquiries to associates of Victor's, hinting at discrepancies in the storage unit accounts and transactions linked to Sophia. Each email was precise, calibrated to trigger concern without revealing our hand. Elias monitored responses, scanning for vulnerabilities in Victor's network. The thrill of the hunt, combined with the knowledge of his betrayal, sharpened my focus. I felt reborn, not just intellectually but emotionally, finally able to harness anger, hurt, and desire into clear action. As we worked, our hands brushed occasionally, each contact lingering just long enough to remind us that this was no longer merely business. One time, I reached for a pen, and our fingers collided. Elias caught my hand, his grip firm but tender. "You're incredible," he murmured, and the sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I smiled, unable to suppress a flicker of warmth. "I have good allies," I replied, letting my eyes hold his longer than necessary. There was an unspoken understanding. This partnership, born of necessity, was becoming far more intimate than either of us had expected. By mid-afternoon, the evidence began to take effect. Calls from concerned colleagues and whispers from Victor's contacts reached us, confirming that the trail we'd set was working. He was already off balance, and the precision of our actions amplified the impact. Every verified detail of financial discrepancies, every document linking him to the hidden apartment, tightened the net around him. And through it all, Elias remained by my side, guiding the maneuvers, sharing insights, and subtly challenging me, mentally, professionally, and emotionally. During a quiet lull, I found myself leaning closer to him, the hum of the city below fading into the background. "We've done more in a day than he's done in years," I said, a trace of admiration in my voice. He chuckled softly, his gaze meeting mine, and I felt the tension between us spike. "That's the thing about us," he said. "We're meticulous, ruthless, and we actually care about integrity." My pulse quickened, and in a moment of impulsive boldness, I let my hand brush against his, holding it just a beat longer. His eyes darkened slightly, intensity giving way to something softer, charged. He leaned closer under the pretense of reviewing a spreadsheet, and my breath caught. There was no space left for restraint, for hesitation. When our lips met, it was tentative at first, a careful exploration, then quickly deepened into a hunger we had both denied until this point. The kiss was more than desire. It was trust, validation, and a shared triumph. We pulled back slightly, foreheads touching, breaths mingling. I realized that the fire between us wasn't just attraction. It was respect, partnership, and the acknowledgement that we were stronger together than apart. The moment passed, but the electric charge lingered, infusing our work with renewed energy. We returned to the laptop and the files, but now every move, every decision carried the thrill of proximity, the unspoken promise of more. Victor's web was unraveling, his deception laid bare, and I finally felt free, emotionally, strategically, and morally. As evening approached, Elias paused, leaning back in his chair, eyes meeting mine with a mischievous gleam. "Tomorrow we finish this," he said. "And after that we figure out exactly what this connection between us means." I smiled, my heart racing, realizing that the rebirth wasn't just about exposing betrayal, it was about embracing a future where passion, intellect, and loyalty coexisted. And for the first time in years, I was entirely ready to step into it. Morning arrived with a quiet intensity. The city hummed outside the apartment windows, oblivious to the storm we were about to unleash. Elias and I sat side by side, reviewing the last batch of documents, our hands occasionally brushing, a small, intimate reminder that this battle was ours to win, together. I felt calm, razor-sharp, the clarity from my rebirth carrying me through every thought, every click of the mouse. Victor had no idea we were closing in. His arrogance, once charming in small doses, had become the very flaw we exploited. Each email, each bank statement, each note linking him to Sophia and the secret apartment was a piece of the puzzle, meticulously arranged to show the breadth of his deception. This wasn't about vengeance for its own sake. It was a surgical, intellectual takedown, a reclamation of my agency, my pride. And Elias, with his sharp instincts and unwavering support, was the perfect partner for the execution. We began by notifying key stakeholders in Victor's circle. Carefully crafted letters detailed the financial discrepancies, the secret property, and the coordinated pattern of personal and professional deceit. The language was precise, unassailable, leaving no room for interpretation or excuse. I watched each sent message with a mixture of satisfaction and awe at how cleanly this operation had unfolded. Every word was truth, and truth was now our weapon. Elias leaned close, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His presence grounded me, reminded me that the triumph wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. "Ready for the fallout?" he asked, a subtle smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I nodded, feeling the adrenaline spike. "Completely. And we'll handle it together." There was something in the firmness of his tone, the certainty, that made my heart race in ways unrelated to strategy or success. By mid-afternoon, the first reactions rolled in. Victor's colleagues and investors were stunned, questions flooding in, reputations teetering. He called me once, voice laced with disbelief and panic, but I refused to engage. Instead, I let Elias take the lead, calmly explaining the evidence, outlining the steps that were already being taken, and ensuring there would be no way for Victor to spin the narrative. I watched him handle the chaos with quiet authority and a surge of admiration mixed with something deeper. This man, who had once been a figure of support in the background, was now unmistakably central to my life, in every sense. As evening approached, we allowed ourselves a brief respite, standing together at the window, the city lights shimmering below. The tension of the day, the thrill of outmaneuvering someone who had betrayed us, began to soften into something intimate. Elias turned to me, eyes dark with emotion. "You've been incredible," he said, voice low, almost reverent. I've never met anyone with your mind or your courage. My breath hitched, and I felt the magnetic pull between us, the bond forged in fire and strategy. Without thinking, I reached for him, our lips meeting in a kiss that was equal parts relief, triumph, and desire. It was a kiss that said more than words ever could, acknowledging the pain of betrayal, the exhilaration of victory, and the promise of something wholly new and uncompromised. He deepened it gently, hands cradling my face, and I felt an undeniable certainty. This was right. This was ours. Later, as we sat side by side, sipping quiet tea and reviewing final confirmation that Victor's plans were completely undone, I realized the full extent of my rebirth. I had taken control, exposed deception, and reclaimed every bit of autonomy I had lost. And more than that, I had discovered a partner who matched me in intellect, in strength, and now in heart. Elias was no longer just an ally. He was my choice, my confidant, my equal. The city outside moved on, oblivious to the fall of a man who had underestimated us. But inside, in our small sanctuary of reclaimed power and newfound love, I felt a profound peace. Betrayal had been the catalyst for transformation, and in its wake, I had found clarity, justice, and a partner worth fighting for. Elias leaned closer, brushing his lips against my temple, and whispered, "We did it together." I smiled, heart full, and whispered back, "Together." For the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what I wanted. And I was ready to embrace it fully, mind, heart, and soul.